Welcome to the latest episode of the Agency Accelerator podcast. In this week's episode, I am really excited to interview a very old colleague of mine, Pietro Ranieri, who runs the Ranieri agency. Now, Pietro was actually my very first employee when I ran my agency, and after being with us for 9 years, he left to set up his own business. And in this episode, we're going to talk about that journey from going from a freelancer to running an agency. We're going to talk about some of the pitfalls of growing your agency. And we're also going to talk about selling an agency, because Pietro's actually sold his agency, bought it back, and he's also acquired a number of other agencies. So today he runs a multinational PR agency with offices across the world. So without further ado, let's get on with today's show.
Accelerate your agency's profitable growth with tools, tips, and value-added interviews with your host, agency owner and coach, Rob DaCosta.
So welcome to the latest episode of the Agency Accelerator podcast. I'm really excited to have Pietro Ranieri from Ranieri Communications. Now, Pietro and I go back a way long time. And in fact, Pietro was my very first employee when I ran my PR agency. So I think we've probably known each other since about 1994. And since then, Pietro has set up his own agency, which has gone great guns, has grown, has opened offices multinationally, has won a number of awards. So I'm really excited to have Pietro on board today to talk about how it feels to scale an agency, some of the challenges that he's faced, and just generally share some great experiences with you. So hopefully that's a decent intro, Pietro, but do you want to fill in any gaps?
Hi Rob, nice to catch up again. So I'm Pietro. It's actually Ranieri Agency now. We've recently rebranded.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. But we've been running for around 17 years now. But in that time, I sold the agency to a PLC, grew it within a PLC, bought some agencies to add to it, bought it all back. And we're now in sort of UK, France, 2 offices in Germany. But we're a consumer electronics, B2B tech and gaming digital marketing agency. So we've come a long way in that since you very kindly gave me my shot and took me on however many years ago it was now.
Yeah, wow. So, God, you've been through the kind of full range of things that could happen in an agency. So I think my first question to you really is, so Pietro worked with me for, I think, about 9 years before he left to set up his own agency. So if you can cast your mind back 17 years, Pietro, what were the goals that you had when you first started the agency?
Well, people often ask me this story, and I think I have to be honest. And when I very first started the agency, actually, I wasn't leaving you, Rob, to start an agency. I actually went to go freelance because back at the time, 17 years ago, the sort of freelance life was, it was quite lucrative. You could start to become your own sort of boss and sort of look out, change the sort of lifestyle that, at the time I'd kind of met a girl who's now my wife, and basically she lived in London. I lived outside of London. And what I was finding is sort of going backwards and forwards to see her, then go to, come back to the office in Milton Keynes. It was proving quite tiring. And I guess at that time I don't know how, I was still in my 20s then. My life was prioritized, by her and not work. And I just sort of changed my life to sort of suit that lifestyle. So when I first left, it was because I ended up getting a freelance job for another agency that, funnily enough, we competed against quite a lot of the time. And they paid me, it was more than my existing salary for doing 7 or 8 days work a month. So I ended up kind of getting more salary, leaving, and having quite a lot of free time. And that's kind of how I got into it. So it wasn't really any sort of, master plan to kind of start an agency. It was more me just sort of thinking, right, I just want to change my lifestyle and, spend more time with this person. But actually, because of the environment at the time, there was a real opportunity to do it and not sort of suffer in terms of, income. But also, at that time, I was a single guy. I had a house, which my parents had very fortunately helped me with. So I didn't have any children or any kind of, any sort of dependence or anything like that would kind of potentially stop me doing it. I mean, at the time, the worst that could happen was that I'd just have to get another job.
That story will resonate with a lot of people, because I think a lot of people start out with the intention of freelancing, and then something happens, which I'm interested to hear from you, that leads you to make that switch from having this mindset of being a freelancer to having a mindset of, actually, I want to grow my agency now, even if you're still just one man band to start with. So what was that for you that led you to go from freelancing lifestyle to actually want to grow an agency?
The agency thing probably happened, I would say, about 2 or 3 years later, when you could sort of start to say, well, it was becoming a little agency where I had an office and a couple of employees to kind of work with me. But what really happened was, again, I'd sort of been working at home in my bedroom for quite a period of time, probably about a year and a half at this point. And even back then, I mean, I started off with a couple of clients that one was an agency, one was a web design agency that I'd got to know. I think there was a couple of others, but even then, I was starting to get sort of international clients, mainly because the environment that you'd put me into, in your agency, that was my kind of contact base. So I was just naturally sort of gravitating towards that. So what I was finding that I'd be getting up late in the daytime, because all my clients were coming online later on because they were US based, and I was just finding that I was starting to become quite detached from the world, because I'd be getting up late. I'd just sort of wander over to my second bedroom where my office was. I'd get to the end of the day and I'd realised I still hadn't really got washed or any of the kind of normal things that you should do. People were coming home from work in the sort of houses around me, and I'm still sort of in my pajamas. I mean, I remember one sort of specific day where I think I'd got up late. I think I'd watched Dr. Phil, like back-to-back episodes for about 3 episodes or something. And then I watched this real sort of trashy film in the afternoon. And I just thought, what the hell am I doing with my life? I can't, this can't carry on. So I just decided to get myself a little office, which was still in the local area, just so I could get up in the morning and go to work and start to have that sort of separation between my home space and my workspace. The irony is, here we are sort of 18 years later, or whatever the time frame is, and I'm sort of sat at home again because of the lockdown, and I'm just, all these memories are coming
Bigger
back.
House now, though.
Yes, it's slightly bigger, but it's a bit more crowded these days. A bit noisier with the young kids running around. But it's kind of, I'm starting to get those same sort of frustrations. I think because I'm naturally a social person. I mean, I work in PR. I mean, that was originally what I was doing. I get very frustrated. I need that sort of interaction of people in the office and kind of, going out and meeting people and just sort of that general sort of contact with other humans.
So once you got the office, what was the next bit of the journey to hiring the first member of staff? Because that is a huge hurdle that a lot of growing agencies have to leap over when they take that first person on.
Well, in the early days, I mean, I very much ran my own sort of income, was thinking that, because the first contract I had with the other agency was like a 6-month contract. Then I won a couple of other little bits and pieces, and I just kind of, and probably again, just sort of good mindset that you guys instilled in me, was that eventually you always lose those clients, or you think you should sort of plan for the fact that you're probably going to lose those clients at some point. So even back then in my sort of early days, I was always looking for new business. But what actually happened in the first sort of couple of years, I did keep sort of winning business. Don't forget, it was a kind of sort of boom time back then. Not, I wouldn't boom time. It's not. It certainly wasn't a recession. But all the business I was winning, expecting some of the earlier accounts to drop off eventually, they didn't drop off, and I got to the point where I just had too much work on, and I'd had the office, and then I just thought, well, okay, well, let me hire somebody and just sort of see if we can pick up some of the work so I can carry on winning work, but just always anticipating that, when I look at the figures, if one drops off, are we still going to be able to maintain that person? Because like I say, that first person is really where you're probably most exposed in terms of revenue and stuff, because you have enough revenue for yourself. But when you hire somebody, suddenly you have to make sure you prioritize their salary. And if you don't, if the money doesn't come in, you still have to pay that salary. So
exactly, you become the back of the queue for being fed, don't you?
Yeah, I have been ever since.
Now, the one thing that you did really well, and I always say that when we ran CIT, we did many things badly, but the one thing we did well, and you've done well as well, is had a clear niche from day one. So I guess I know why you have that niche, but it's probably good for the listeners to understand that from the beginning, you had a niche, and was that a conscious decision to say that's where we're going to focus?
It wasn't early on, but it did become a conscious decision later on. And well, let me explain. So basically, when I left you, I went into sort of technology PR, which is kind of what we were doing at the time, because obviously that's what I knew. But very quickly after I went on my own, Apple launched the iPod, and back then, some kind of accessories started to appear. So you had things like silicon cases for the iPod. Then there were sort of headphones, little kind of speakers that would sort of plug into the iPod. That kind of early sort of mass consumer electronics that sort of Apple really sort of pioneered with the launch of the iPod. But kind of as that market started to develop, a lot of the early accessory brands came from the Mac market, because obviously the iPod was a Mac product. Our background, Rob, was sort of more Mac market oriented. So kind of the early accessory brands were coming from the Mac market because it was, products that fit around the iPod. And then obviously because we were in the Mac market, I was starting to get a lot of inquiries from people I knew in the industry, or journalists were referring, good Mac people, Mac PR people to these brands when they were asking, who can help me, promote these brands. So very early on, as soon as the iPod launched, we were just starting to pick up this kind of early wave of consumer electronics accessory products. And that's kind of sort of how we ended up going down that road. But when we made a conscious decision was to kind of few years into that. So if you kind of roll on, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, we had quite a lot of consumer accessories brands that were very predominantly sort of Mac based, but we also had some other sort of miscellaneous products. I mean, I remember one of the accounts that I was working on was actually an illegal logging tracking system. So basically, it was able to track a piece of timber all the way through the supply chain. So from kind of tree stump in the Congo where it was chopped down to chair leg in B&Q. So they could monitor the process all the way through. But when you're sort of predominantly doing consumer electronics in your agency, and then you win a client and then try and introduce that into the same set of staff, they would do it, obviously, but it was a really big learning curve. So, you suddenly had all these sort of brands that they were comfortable with and they were talking to at the time, consumer electronics friendly magazines. And then you threw in like illegal logging. And suddenly they had to learn about illegal logging, and they had to learn about all the kind of journalists, all the kind of the subjects in that sort of area. So kind of taking on brands like that, which were completely different to what we were, effectively good at, suddenly put a massive ball and chain around the agency, because it just really distracted from where we made our money. You ended up having one account which took 50% of everybody's time, and that was the account that we weren't actually making that much money on anyway.
Can I just interrupt you, because I just want to unpick a couple of those things before we move on? Some really important lessons that I think we can all learn, and they're things that I am always sort of shouting out from my gospel, which is you want to be as niched as you possibly can, especially in the early days. And if you listen to Pietro's story, you'll see that he was a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. So he was started out with tech, focused that tech in the consumer space, focused that into the Mac space, and focused that into the accessories space. And so it becomes very easy to show up as an expert and a real authority when you have that clarity on your niche. So that's one thing I just wanted to pick up. And then the second thing I wanted to say is that the example of the logging tech client that you took on is a really good example of what happens when we take on our less than ideal clients, and how much harder they are to manage because we don't understand them so well. So we have to work extra hard to do a decent job. And I don't know how that story ended, but you can tell us. But a lot often what happens with people is that they end up losing those clients because they can't build the same kind of relationship that they can with a client that is right in the core niche that they are specialists in.
Yeah, just picking up on that, Rob. I mean, I think the lesson I learned very quickly was, yes, you can add to your revenue by picking up that client, but that client, which kind of sits as a little sort of outpost to the rest of your core business, it does draw all the resources from the rest of your team, but it also kind of potentially upsets the team as well, because nobody really wants to work on it. Nobody really wants to sort of spend the time learning it. It's not really even worth investing in that client, because it's not like you're going to pick up another brand in that space. Just really, it's, you'll end up losing the client, but what you're not actually losing is that revenue. It's all the kind of, the secondary time and revenue and, emotion that goes with that account on the rest of the agency. Yeah, it's just, I think when you're early and you're sort of a younger, smaller business, you obviously you're trying to build the revenue as quickly as you can. But, sort of staying focused on what you're good at in the long term will kind of benefit you a lot more.
Yeah, and you're a great testament to that, because over what it was 17, 18 years, you've pretty much stayed true to the sector that you started in. Yes, you've broadened out a bit into things like gaming and stuff that probably wasn't really around much in the early days, but you've pretty much stayed true to that. So I guess the thing is, if you find a niche that is big enough, then there's no reason why you'd need to take on a logging kind of client, is there really?
I mean, I didn't sort of start Ranieri Agency thinking, right, I'm going to go after this market, and that's because I'm good at this space. It's just, we started off that way with the iPod and the accessories guys, but the industry itself has just continued to kind of expand. I mean, it's now developed into, like say, we've got a gaming division. If you look at consumer electronics, it's now kind of split into sort of fitness, smart home, health, audio. I mean, anything that's got that sort of technology DNA, I mean, that's what we sort of do. So we were lucky to kind of be at the very beginning of a space which grew massively. But there are equally, other areas out there. Like if you're in, I don't know, if you're in fashion, then you'd probably want to be concentrated in certain parts of fashion. It could be clothing, or it could be cosmetics, or it could be, so it's just kind of doing what you're good at, really. Or more importantly, if you want to kind of build an agency, it's focusing on what your team are good at as well, because it's not about you at the end of the day.
Well, that leads me really nicely, sort of segues onto the next question that I've got for you. So if some of our listeners are running a small agency, they may have one or two staff and they aspire to grow beyond that. What advice would you give them about that journey?
Yeah, well, I've got a really good partnership with an agency in North America called Max Borges, amongst many other partnerships, but that one in particular, I've known him for a long time. And he sort of stressed to me early on, the real definition of a PR agency is, are you a PR guy with loads of assistants, or do you have a PR agency? And the difference is, if like, for example, I can walk out of my agency now and has no effect on client work because I don't work on any clients. And that isn't me being lazy. That's a kind of conscious decision to let other people run the client, so I can kind of focus on, looking at the bigger agency and how we grow it. But if you pull me out and suddenly all the clients start screaming, then you don't have a PR agency, because basically you're a PR person with assistants. And there's a sort of lesson in that where, you as quickly as possible, you have to make sure that your team is the client contact and the team is delivering the service. Now, that doesn't mean you just suddenly, sit back and don't do anything and like just let them get on with it. Over time, you need to understand, how to either train the people up that you've got in place to run those accounts, or you hire in the right people. Even further before that, you have to make sure that the client interaction that you have with you as a an agency person, the interaction you have with those clients, the initial interaction, it kind of sets the scene for how you move forward with that client. So, for example, if a lead comes into Ranieri, and it might come through, I don't know, the website or a referral from someone in the industry, the first thing I will do is I'll say, yeah, great to meet you. Let's set a meeting up to kind of talk about your requirements. Have you got an RFP, all that kind of stuff, because I want to pass that to my team to look at so that they can start to come back to you with a proposal. So the language that I'm using straight away, immediately on their first engagement with me, is my team are going to start looking at this. So it's kind of little things like that. So even though I might work on the proposal with the team, I don't want to be the person that leads that proposal, because if we then win the work, that client will then expect me to be part of that journey with them moving forward. And I don't want to be part of that journey. And the reason is, it's not that I'd love to work on an account, but every day I work on an account is taking me away from what I should be doing, which is running the agency.
What you've just said, I need to put in really big neon letters, because I think I have clients, and I know other companies suffer from this same thing, where the agency owner is this really strong entrepreneurial figurehead that clients love, and the clients want them to work on the account, and perhaps they have more junior staff, so there's a big gap between them and the rest of the team, and therefore they don't want to lose control. They don't trust their teams enough to delegate effectively, and we're stuck in this vicious circle of the agency owner being the reason why the agency has grown to a certain size, and also then being the reason why the agency can't grow beyond that size, because they can't get out of their own way.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, when you work in an agency, and you're employed, like, when I was working for you, everything is about you being the person. So you've got the contacts, you want the client to kind of, have that relationship with you. You want to have that sort of, not self-importance, but you make yourself valuable by kind of having the contacts and having the relationships. When you become an agency owner, it's the opposite. You as the owner need to make your employees the people with the value and the contacts and the client relationships, because that's how you'll grow. Because if it's everything's related to you all the time, sometimes, I've met a lot of people, that PR people particularly, that they do like to have this kind of control on who's got the most relationships in the room. But actually, that's the thing that will stop them growing when they actually start on their own. It's a great thing to have when you start, but as soon as you start getting employees, you need to nurture them and mentor them to kind of be better than you, because that's how you'll grow the agency.
So what advice would you give to that agency owner that's maybe got 4 or 5 staff, but they are still completely entrenched in doing client works because the clients want them on the accounts, and because the owner of the agency doesn't trust their staff to do as good a job as they would, and therefore they don't delegate as well as they could?
Yeah, well, there's two things there. I mean, the first thing is, I think you really need to understand the sort of capability of your staff. Because one thing I'm certainly not saying, just give all the work to your staff, let them get on with it and see how they go. You need to understand those staff and make sure that, there will be certain people in there that will be maybe better at social media. Some will be better at kind of client relationships. Some will be better at copywriting, all those kind of, understanding those skills. Because what you can actually do is work with those employees to effectively give them a career plan to say, look, I want to step back a bit. I want to kind of make sure we grow the business so I can focus on BD, all that kind of stuff. What do you want from this agency? Do you want to be an account director? Do you want to be the MD one day? Do you want to, and start to plan that out? Because the quicker you engage those employees, the quicker they will kind of feel, like they're part of the journey as well. So that everybody's kind of, because running an agency, what you've got to imagine, the most important part of the agency is staff. Staff are what kind of make that thing. Without staff, there's nothing there at all. There's no skills, there's no nothing. And the quicker you can motivate those staff the right way, and all in the right direction, all understanding kind of what their role is, where their kind of career path is, all of that kind of stuff, then everything starts to work better. And also you'll retain staff a lot longer if you kind of give them what they want as well. And giving them what they want doesn't mean more money. That's one thing. Another lesson I learned on the way was, because I'm quite shallow and motivated by money. I was in the early days. I just assumed that everyone else was like me, and if I paid them more, they'd work harder towards a target of money. But I probably found that over 50% of people aren't that way. They're not motivated that way. Actually, they're motivated by status, or they're motivated by sort of job satisfaction in the kind of things that they do, or they want to work in a particular area, or just things that everyone's motivated in a different way.
And it's also a generational thing, isn't it? Because you're probably an X-gen, and a lot of your staff will be Y-gens or millennials, and they're all motivated by different things.
I mean, I'm like, I went through this period of a few years ago where you start employing those younger guys, and they're like, oh well, I need to work from home more, and I need to do this more, and it's like you sort of offer them a pay rise, and they almost like don't acknowledge it. And I'm like, what the hell's going on here? I don't understand this. And yet, if you give them an extra day's holiday, it's like, I've doubled their salary. So I never, but yeah.
So true.
Yeah. So it's kind of getting a real handle on that, because I think what you need to sort of identify is, have you got the right staff? But, and who are your stars, because of very early on, you can sort of very quickly see, the people you could imagine in front of clients as more senior, or the kind of more sort of, it might be that there's a head of social media division that you could give them, because don't forget, it's PR, right? So even if it's a small agency, you can still give people status, and you can still make people earn that status as well. So they don't, because the worst thing again you can do is just start giving people things what they want, because it almost becomes they have to earn those things. But when they do earn them and they are good enough, they should be rewarded as well. So everyone's on that kind of motivational thing. The other thing as well is, and equally as important, if not more, is, like I was saying before, this kind of interaction you have with brands. As the agency owner, you need to kind of distance yourself from the first bit of contact. So like I was saying before, if you want that brand to be happy with another team member, the very first bit of communication that you have with them is like, they might call you, you might say, yeah, it's great, I love your product. You go through the whole pitch process, but you kind of say, right, I'm going to give this to my team to review. I'm going to let them have a look at it. They'll come back to you with a proposal, and you can still be in the pitch. You can still keep an eye on it, but your language is all about, let's say your brand is an audio product. The exec that you have in that pitch, you make sure that they can go through like a reviews program or something, and they kind of show real knowledge of those contacts and examples that they've done in the past. So what you're doing is you're building some trust and some credibility within those people right from the early days. You as the agency owner, it doesn't matter who you know, it doesn't matter what you've done, because at the end of the day, the client can see through that. You almost need to create the pitch around making your staff look great, and they've got the contact. So you're positioning your agency as this place which has loads of talented people, and you can't wait for them to work on that brand. It's not you doing the work.
It's the difference between the brand being you or the brand being an agency, isn't it? And I think that's something people get wrong. They do actually employ a few staff, but fundamentally the business is still them. It's like the way you described it is brilliant. It's like you're a freelancer with a bunch of assistants. I wanted to ask you one other question, which is to do with succession planning and selling, because when I meet a lot of clients and I ask them what their bigger picture goal is, they'll tell me that they want to exit their agency. They probably want to sell it, and they've got this dream of selling it for millions. And sadly, that is very rarely realized. So we might talk about succession planning being delegating down and giving them more flexibility or something else. But given that you've sold your agency and then bought it back, and you've bought a few agencies as well, what's your experience? What would you say the pros and cons of thinking like that are?
I've obviously done quite a lot of M&A now. So, the first experience I had of it was selling my own agency, which in hindsight didn't go that well, which is kind of why I ended up going through a process and buying it all back out. But, I kind of see it as I learned a lot through that process, because I made a lot of mistakes in my own sale, and most of it was because I just didn't know what I didn't know. And that, and I think anyone would have made that mistake. What you don't know is what you don't know. So when I was selling my business for the first time, I sold it on good faith, and there was lots of things that I didn't realize what was happening, and but kind of what it ended up giving me was a real sort of knowledge base of what not to do, but also what to look for in agencies when I'm buying them now, and what the value is in businesses as well. So I've kind of then went through, I successfully bought 3 agencies under the PLC that I was working with. And the thing I learned as well is, most agencies, with kind of consultancy based businesses like PR businesses or, social media businesses, they are quite, there's quite a formula to kind of buying and selling them. They all sort of inherently have the same sort of issues. They're all reliant on certain clients. They're all reliant on certain staff. And I think, this kind of perception that they're worth millions and millions is sort of wrong. You generally won't make millions. And what will actually happen is you'll be on some kind of earn out period as well. So, because when people buy an agency, they're not stupid. They realize that the most important thing in that agency is the clients that it has, the staff that it has. They'll buy it over a period of time because they want to make sure, when the owner finally does kind of step away, which is obviously the whole point of that owner doing it, whatever they tell you, they want to be left with a business, and a business that then they can kind of earn that money back as well that they've kind of put in. So if you think, right, well, I'm going to buy this business for 5 million quid, right, how's that owner going to get that 5 million quid back with interest? Because don't forget, they're usually investors or bigger agencies. If you're going to spend that kind of money, then at some point they're going to want to make money. So you have to be able to sort of show that. So yeah, it's kind of, I've been through a lot of potential agency acquisitions as well that haven't completed. And usually the thing that kind of breaks down the whole process is the expectations of the owner. Just because I think a lot of them, if they're doing it first time, they just have no idea. Because usually what will happen is a broker will get involved, and that will be the person that gives them the idea to kind of, start selling. And they'll say, oh, your agency's worth this much. But, they're trying to get you, they're trying to hook you so that you kind of think, yeah, actually, my agency is worth this much. And if I use him and pay him $5,000 a month, then he'll get my agency ready for sale and blah, blah, blah. But actually, just like any other business, they're just trying to get you on retainer, and they sell something at the end of it, great, but they can string that out for a couple of years. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff to look out for.
I think it's, so much of that resonates with me. When we sold the agency, I don't think it was a very happy marriage, really. And I don't know if you know this actually, but at the end of our 2-year earn out, they offered to sell us the agency back, and at which point I said no thanks. But I think a really good bit of advice there is to make sure you have realistic expectations, because I think people get swept away by the ego of and the flattery of that I've built this baby and now someone wants to buy it, and they don't. And the reality is, of course, that, as you say, it's going to be backloaded on earn out numbers. You're going to be tied in for a number of years, and there's a good chance that you may not achieve a lot of that earn out, so the number ends up looking a lot smaller than you thought. So I think when I talk to people about succession, I try to encourage them to think of different things besides just exit, like I say, building up an agency that other people can run, or taking more of a non-exec type of role in their agency in the end, that kind of thing.
They get these wild expectations of what their agency is worth, but a typical agency is usually going to be something like 3 to 7 times EBIT, but that's after they've taken like a nominalized value for the actual owner's salary. And this is what people sort of get wrong. I think that's the big mistake. So if you're going to sell a business, and let's say you turn over £1 million and you make 100,000 profit, but is that profit clear after the MD's salary? Because don't forget, if somebody buys that agency, they're going to want someone to run it. I know you take your salary as dividends out of that 100,000, then the company who's acquiring you will nominalize that to be your salary. So if you're doing like an EBIT calculation to get the value, then basically if you've cleared 10k after dividends, your value is 60k for that £1 million agency. And that's what people, where they fall down and suddenly think, well, I'm worth a lot more, and you're not.
Yeah, it's because they get told they get these people telling them that their agency's worth 1 times revenue or 9 times profit or something like that, and it's just not true. And so I completely agree with you. That's really useful. And like I say, a lot when I meet a lot of clients and I ask them what their longer term game plan is, they'll tell me they want to sell up, and I'll ask them why. Because often I think as well, people throw the golden goose out of the bath. That's mixing my analogies there, but sometimes people have got something good, they just aren't running it in a way that frees them up, and they sell it for something that's worth way less than the potential earnings over a number of years.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the mistakes I made. I mean, you think, okay, someone offers you money and it's quite a lot of money. If you were to get that money today, it seems like quite a lot of money. But if once you've been through your sort of 3-year earn out, and like, in your case, they obviously absorb your brand. In that 3 years, your brand has gone, you're at the end of your journey, you've come out with it with a bit of money, which is probably equivalent to, I don't know, 2 or 3 years salary. What do you do then?
Yeah, it's nothing. Buy a house in Spain.
Yeah, you're basically down to pre-agency with no brand and enough money to last you for a bit.
Well, and also being on the entrepreneurs that we are, you suddenly realize lying on a beach in the Mediterranean is something you don't want to do except for your sort of few weeks a year's holiday, and you probably can't afford to do it full time anyway. So I think that's something I learned, is like, oh my God, what am I going to do next? My whole sort of self-esteem was based on my business, and now I don't have that. So, it was actually I've spoken about this before, but me at the end of my 2-year earn out was a really bad time in my life, because I'd lost a sense of who I was, and I had to reestablish that as I became a coach. So that's another bit of advice I say to people, is know what the hell you're going to do next before you sell.
When I sold it to this PLC, my feelings of regret happened almost like the next day. It wasn't the money and all that, because at that time I thought I'd done the right thing. But it was just that I suddenly felt like I'd lost control, and I was like, well, it's not mine anymore. Why? I can't be bothered with this. Why am I doing this? Why am I working for them? It was like almost immediate. And I think, again, if you've been running a business for a while, I think you've really got to be sure that it's the right thing to do, because you need to be able to sort of wake up the next day and report to somebody. You wouldn't have done that, and you certainly, won't like it when it happens, because it's just, you become, I think you told me this, you become like unemployable as an entrepreneur, because basically, you're either like a journeyman where you kind of start off in an organization, you go up in that organization, and you're like, on that sort of corporate ladder, and you understand your place in that ladder. But when you're an entrepreneur, you are your own little corporate entity, and no one's going to tell you anything.
And why do people start their own businesses? One of the major reasons people want to start their own businesses because they want to be in control. If we acknowledge that, then why the hell would you want to give that control away to somebody else? Or you better have your eyes open when you make that decision, because I remember feeling exactly the same. We went from having a 25-man agency to suddenly being part of a 2,000-man business. And I remember, I very quickly saw all the politics and bureaucracy and the trudging through quicksand, and I kept putting my foot in it because I had opinions about everything, because I could do that when I was running my agency. And I quickly learned that I needed to keep my mouth shut and pick my battles wisely. And I think I look at those 2 years and think they were an interesting experience, and I learned quite a lot, but I'd never do it again. Let me ask you one final question. This is a question that I ask everybody who comes on the podcast. And if you could jump into a time machine and go back in time and give young whippersnapper Pietro, who was just leaving CIT and starting out on his own, some advice, what advice would you give him?
I mean, I would definitely make sure that I did it. When I first started thinking about leaving, I was met with this kind of wall of reasons why I shouldn't. And mainly because the people that I asked were, I don't know, friends and family, like my parents, all of these kinds of people. It's not that they gave me the wrong advice, but it was just that they gave me advice based on their own understanding of the world. So all the people I were asking had never kind of set up their own business. They'd always worked for somebody else. The questions they were asking me, in hindsight, I know are the wrong things. So if I was going to ask someone for advice, or advise myself, the first thing I'd get them to do is make sure they spoke to someone who had done it already. And just so the thing that they're trying to do, make sure they speak to that person that's already done it and succeeded or failed at it. Because I think the one that fails at something probably has got more advice to offer than the one that succeeds. Because if you've only ever kind of been successful at what you're doing, it's great, but you're still in this bubble of whatever you touch works, and at some point you're going to make a mistake. But I think that's just inevitable with business. So it's like, for example, the situation we're in now. Everything I've learned in the last sort of 20 years of running my own business, or however long it's been, it's kind of helping me every day in this situation that we're in. Because the irony is, a lot of kind of businesses that have started up probably in the last couple of years are probably very anxious at the moment, and because they've never sort of seen this kind of thing before. And I've already been through a recession. I've been through starting up a business. I've been through the anxiety of what many people are sort of potentially feeling right now. And it's that kind of feeling that actually, it's probably going to be all right, as long as you kind of got good processes in place and you stick to it. It's that kind of, you got to make sure you just, every time you get hit, get up and get on with it, because that's what kind of makes you successful. That's what I advise myself. Make sure you speak to someone that knows what they're doing or has done it, and just keep going.
Great advice. Last week I wrote an email out to my audience, which was called The Lonely Life of the Agency Owner, talking about how it's lonely at the top of an agency and how we need to create a good network of people that can advise us, whether that be a coach, a mentor, other accountability partners, other agency owners. Because when we go in and ask our friends or our family or our spouses their opinion, they're coming from a place of love and support, but they don't understand. So I completely kind of get that. Pietro, if people want to find out more about you and Ranieri, where would they go?
Probably the best place is LinkedIn. So we've got a Ranieri agency LinkedIn page. Obviously, I've got my own LinkedIn, so Pietro Ranieri.
We'll put all those details into the show notes. And listen, I could have spoken, we could have gone on for hours. I've tried to keep these podcasts to half an hour, but we're already at 45 minutes. I definitely need to come have you back on, Pietro, so we can drill into some of the things that we didn't get to talk about today, like opening second offices and a bunch of other things that I know the audience is interested in. But I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, no worries. It's a pleasure. And thanks again for giving me my break, Rob.
You're welcome. So a longer episode than usual, but I hope you'll agree that was packed with some really actionable, useful advice, especially around growing your agency and making yourself not the front point of contact as soon as possible, and also some thoughts around succession planning, what that could mean for you, and some warnings, I guess, around selling your agency. As ever, if you enjoyed today's episode, then please consider leaving a review and also sharing with your colleagues. And other than that, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I will see you back here on the Agency Accelerator podcast next Thursday.